too much.
We're just trying to do kind of a big picture thing as we go through all the details.
Yeah. So, because since you've done that, though, I'll be able to pull out a little bit more as we hit a few things, a few concepts.
They know everything about the wisdom.
Probably so. Probably so. So anyway, James chapter 1, verse 12. We ended 2 weeks ago with verse 12, but I'm going to pick up with verse 12 this week again. It says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness that God requires. Therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls." Okay, so we finished up, like I said last time, with verse 12. We talked about this concept of this one who remains steadfast under trials. And I ended there because I think it kind of forms a sort of inclusio with verse 2. Inclusio being same concept at the beginning and at the end of a section. So you see in verse 2, "Count it all joy, brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." And then, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial." How do you remain steadfast under trial? How do you continue to be faithful and pushing on under this trial that is set against you, to resist you, to oppress you? How do you do that? Well, one of the primary ways is that you count it joy when that happens, because you understand its purpose. Because you know that there is a God who is sovereign, who is using that trial to refine your faith and to bring you to perfection and completion in your faith and in your wisdom and your relationship with him. This also, however, serves as a hinge point to move into the next section. Because this word that he talks about here, this word trial, is the word peirasmos in Greek. It is also a word that we sometimes translate as tempt. So trial and temptation. And so those who remain steadfast under trial, when he has stood that test, he will receive the crown of life which God has promised to those who love him. So this trial is something that God orchestrates, something that God administers, if you will, something that God regulates, and something that God rewards when a person endures the trial, when a person is proven by trial and refined by trial. But he says, let no one say when he experiences peirasmos, I am being tempted by God. Okay, so here's the issue. When we have the same word that we can translate as trial or temptation. Okay? Same word in both cases. And so if you're reading the Greek and you see the same word, and you're going through here and saying, clearly James is giving this picture of God as one who is sovereign over the various kinds of trials you experience. And that's the reason you can have joy in those trials, the reason that you should have joy in those trials, because you know God is using those. And then he says, but don't let anyone, when they experience trial, let's pretend we don't have this other word over here. Let's pretend that this is the same Greek word it is. But let no one say when he experiences trial, I am being tested by God. And then all of a sudden you have this seeming contradiction here. How can it be that God is sovereign over peirasmos, and yet God does not cause peirasmos? I read in one commentary this week that said, although since the Reformation, the biggest point of friction in James has been chapter 2, this concept of faith versus works. But in the early days, in the patristic era, in the early church, the biggest problem in James was this passage, because it seems to contradict what Scripture says.
Does the Lord's Prayer say,
Lead us not into temptation? Exactly.
And
Well, how do we do this? He says, you should not say when you're tempted, I'm being tempted by God, because God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. And Jesus said, don't lead us into temptation. Well, if according to James, God doesn't tempt anyone, and no one should say God is tempting them, then why should we pray that? Furthermore, if this word testing is the same as trial or testing, and we use it different ways. Again, the same word that we've found throughout these previous verses, the Bible explicitly says that God tests man, that he tests the heart of men. Genesis tells us that God tested Abraham by telling him to sacrifice his son, that he tested his people in the wilderness. So how do we reconcile this idea that, on one hand, even James is affirming in the first part that God does this kind of action, and now he explicitly says, God does not tempt.
they're the same words?
Same word.
We turn to people like you who are linguists and we say, can you help us with this, please?
Yeah? What do you think? How can it be true that God tests and yet he does not? And a key to it, and I'll just be, I'm trying to wipe out the temptation language here to just emphasize it is the same language in Greek. But one of the keys to understanding, I think, is the fact that we recognize when we translate it that we have to use two different words.
So my understanding is that when God leads us into trials, he does that specifically to cause us to grow, and that he makes those trials for us so that we can cling to him in those trials and see that he is our God, that he is faithful, and that he will bring us through. So often those trials are good things. But if we do not cling to Christ, then we will fail in those trials, and those trials will weigh heavy upon us. So is there an aspect of that in there?
I think so.
Verse 17 says, every good and perfect gift comes from God. And through our trials can bring forth those gifts, the first fruits. And, I see it more like Job. God allowed Satan to tempt, test, whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
God allows it to happen, but I don't.
Yeah. But then you have other passages with it say God directly, actively tested Abraham.
Or he led Jesus into the wilderness to be tested.
Yeah.
Is the idea of temptation, is there two separate parts of it? Like God puts you through a trial, but then like in verse 14, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. The person's response.
Yeah.
I think of it in a couple of different ways. If I was going to say, hey, I'm going to take my buddy out, we're in college, I'm going to take him out, we're going to test him, we're going to see what he's going to do this weekend, right? There's that concept of testing your friend or something like that you see throughout media and stuff like that, right? But if we were to take that concept and set it aside for a second and then say, hey, I'm a biologist or I'm a chemist or whatever, and you're giving me a compound, and I'm going to test that compound, right? I'm not testing that compound to see how it's going to fail or fall short. I'm trying to figure out what it is, trying to see the value or merit or composition of it. And to me, I think these two concepts of testing, tempting, or trialing, right, as you're dealing with, are very similar distinctions there. The testing of the heart, the understanding of what it's made of and what you're going to do, versus saying with more of a malicious intent, as our bent nature is, hey, can I get you to stumble? Those are two different statements altogether.
Yeah.
But God's omniscient and he knows what our character is, so I can only assume then that the temptation and trial, that as the biologist, right, you didn't know what the compound is, but God knows the compound, but we don't know what we are. And so it's revealing to us our character.
I think of that much like when I would teach labs, right? I put compounds out and I call them A, B, and C, but I know exactly what that is and what you're going to be testing it with. And it's really to affirm its nature, not to trick you or get you to fail. And those are two different, it's like those exams, right? Sometimes your instructor gave you an exam and you know it was meant to fail you. And sometimes it was just meant to reaffirm or understand what you have.
I think it's a very good thing. I think you guys both hit it. I think there are two aspects to this that that you both touched on. The first is internal versus external. Okay? Internal versus external. And the second is, how would we say this? I'm trying to sum yours up. Intention, maybe?
Yeah.
Intention, and we'll comment on that a little bit more just to clarify. So internal versus external. I think it's, and I haven't seen anybody say this at all, and I could be way off base, but I have a hunch that perhaps James, because we've seen that, and we will continue to see, that James really has this emphasis on wisdom and being able to make distinctions, correct distinctions. Not being divided, making distinctions within yourself or within the community, but being able to determine what is wisdom and what is not wisdom. What is from God and what is not from God. What is the right way to live as a person over whom his name has been called, and the wrong way to live. And it's almost as if he is using this same word here with two very different kind of meanings to test your ability to make a distinction here. And I could be way off there, but I think it's there. It's at least a little amusing in my mind. Anyway, so when we talk about testing, the kind of testing that he talks about in verse 2. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you experience testing of various kinds. I think that's largely external testings. Okay? It is situations or circumstances that are affecting you, okay? That test your composition, if you will. Now it's not always external. I mean, it could be internal, physically, okay, emotionally, mentally. But those are not evil things in themselves. They're not morally evil things that are impressing upon you this necessity to sin. But they are difficulties, things that challenge your comforts and challenge your beliefs. And those kinds of things, absolutely God is in charge of. And sometimes, I mean, this gets us a little bit uncomfortable here, and this is one of the reasons why this has been historically a very difficult passage in James. Sometimes the Bible even goes so far as to say that even though God is not the author of evil, he's still sovereign over it. That evil cannot happen without God's permission. So you mentioned Job. Okay? You see passages like Habakkuk chapter 1. You know, what do we do about these Chaldeans? And Habakkuk says, no, Lord, I mean, you're too pure eyes to look at evil. How can you use the Chaldeans? I mean, they're worse than we are. You've got, so Nebuchadnezzar, you've got the Assyrians, and that God says that he is my instrument. So God uses evil men and evil situations, and yet he remains free of evil himself. Okay? So the kind of temptation, or as we said, Jesus, you mentioned over here, the Spirit drove Jesus out into the wilderness to be tempted. But God was not the agent of tempting. And so we have to make a distinction here between, number one, and this does, and I'll be honest, this does not perfectly smooth out the problem here. I mean, I think there's always going to be some tension of recognizing Number one, that God is absolutely holy. And he's absolutely sovereign. Absolutely sovereign means he must have some kind of oversight, control over everything that happens. And absolute holiness means he is completely free of any guilt or blemish or stain from sin. Okay? And so in any way we try to resolve these two concepts, historically people have sacrificed one of these two things. In saying, well, no, God is absolutely sovereign, then they're playing with this idea of blaming God for tempting them. I've sinned because God tempted me to do this. This is God's fault that I sinned. God shouldn't have put me in this situation. He shouldn't have dangled this carrot or this, whatever before my eyes. And they sacrifice it because they have such a high view of God's sovereignty. They begin to sacrifice this idea of his holiness. And on the other side, people say, oh no, God's holy. He's absolutely holy. He can never do any kind of evil. I mean, he's untouched by evil, which is perfectly fine with what James says there. But then they begin to struggle with, well, then what do we do with passages like God tested Abraham? Or the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted or tested, and they begin to sacrifice God's sovereignty. Well, there's some things that God isn't sovereign about. Satan just has this free reign. Here's God. I heard one very prominent Baptist preacher about, it was very popular 20 years ago, passed away about 20 years ago, I guess. He used to say, God cast one vote for you, and Satan casts a vote for you, and you cast the deciding vote. I'm telling you, that is bad theology, because it compromises the sovereignty of God. But what that pastor was doing is he was trying to protect God's holiness by sacrificing his sovereignty. Satan is not God's equal. Satan does not have the level of sovereignty that God has, and they're just fighting, toe-to-toe, trying to get the upper hand. Okay? So there is this discomfort in this concept that God is both absolutely holy and yet absolutely sovereign. So the best that we can do is try to find some distinction between, and again, this doesn't even smooth everything out, but the best I think that we can do is try to come to some idea that there are some different ways in which we are tested or tempted. The external ones, and even some of the internal ones. Yes, that God is sovereign over those, and he may cause them, but he does not lead us into sin. And his intention when he does bring the testing is not to see us fall. It is not to cause us to sin. Like, aha, I gotcha.
Well, isn't that exactly what he's summing up in verse 16 and 17? He's kind of, to me, he's making a statement of God's oneness. He's saying, because God has, good gifts have always come from God. We can trust because he's unchanging. Good gifts are always going to come from God. So it's a reminder that, the shortcomings are on us. It's our
Does that mean that everything that God gives is good?
No,
or that every good gift comes from him?
Yeah, I don't think he's talking about materialistic here.
Right.
It's the Spirit.
Okay.
I think Job makes it very clear, right, that our perspective is very limited to the point that we're not capable of standing toe-to-toe in these conversations and understanding them. That's not to say that we shouldn't wrestle with it or try to understand it. It's just, it's beyond our ability to fathom. And I think that we need to be very careful when we do this, that we don't take a petty approach like Job did on his first round of discussion here and say, fine, I'll be silent and whatever, because God didn't take that either. Rebuked him again, called him out again, and said, once you're able to do these things, then I will acknowledge your majesty. And then he turns from that and says, but look at these two things that I've made, right? The behemoth and the Leviathan, both of which God expresses an extreme level of pride in these two pieces of creation, and then both of which he says, these are utterly disastrous for you to be in their presence. You can't handle that. They would destroy you. And to your perspective, they are evil. But these are actually mighty works of my creation that I have done. Look at them. And I think that that's something we need to be careful about when we also look on a less of a physical nature and more into a spiritual nature, between this idea of holiness and sovereignty. We're not going to be able to fathom all of those distinctions and concepts. So we need to make sure that we, at the end of that discussion, end up the same way Job did at the end, with humility.
Right. And that's another aspect that's very prevalent in wisdom. One of the concepts, and we're going to see it here in a bit, one of the primary concepts in wisdom literature is the concept of Yahweh, God, as creator. And because he is creator, he is sovereign over all of his creation. And part of wisdom comes in realizing that as a created being, you can never comprehend the ways of your creator. You can never fully comprehend them. You can know them, but you cannot comprehend them. And so there's always going to be some kind of tension that you won't be able to reconcile, that you will just have to accept and submit to.
So, when we are tempted, we are encouraged that the temptation is not beyond what God feels that we can handle, provided we rely on God. And in that aspect, I think I'm glad that he is sovereign, because he will allow temptation, but he won't allow that temptation to destroy us unless we choose not to cling to God. And then he will allow that temptation to, how do you say, instruct us in a negative way that we cannot do it without him.
Yeah.
So he has to have sovereignty over that in order to make sure that we are not tempted beyond our means, because Satan would destroy us if allowed.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I think that that's a really important passage that we referenced there from 1 Corinthians 10:13, right? It says, no temptation is taken you except for those things that are common to man, right? But God is faithful, and he will not suffer you to be tempted above what you're able, but with that temptation provides a way of escape so that you may be able to bear it. If God was the one that was delivering the temptation, all of Scripture makes it very clear that you have no ability to escape him. There's a whole book in Jonah written in satire about this, right? You cannot escape the will of God. And so if his will is to tempt you with sin, you will fall. And I think that section in Corinthians paired with this makes it very clear, right, that drawn away by our own nature, but God says, wait, there's this door, this way out that I hold open for you each time.
So let's talk about what it says here. No one should say, I'm being tempted by God. Why is that? Why should no one say that? And again, we can come to this question, or we can come to this theoretical statement, which some of us may have even thought before or said before, because of the idea that God is sovereign over testing. But he says you cannot draw that out to the idea that he is intentionally leading you into evil. He's not leading you into sin, trying to entice you to sin, because number one, God cannot be tempted with evil. Like, what's that God being tempted have to do with him tempting me?
This is holy.
The concept here is that God has absolutely no connection, no relationship with evil. That God is not just completely separate from evil, but he has absolutely nothing to do with evil. As I mentioned earlier with Habakkuk, you are of too pure of eyes to even look on evil. God cannot be tempted. Evil cannot approach God in order to try to attempt to tempt God. It's impossible. And if that is true, if there's nothing evil about him, nothing evil in his presence, nothing evil could ever approach his presence, then there is no way that any evil could proceed from him. It's unthinkable. It's impossible. God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself tempts no one. He cannot be the source or the cause of evil, because evil has nothing to do with him. Okay? This is James's clearest and most forceful statement of the absolute holiness of God. Okay? So he says right off the bat, if any of you should ever come to that point, here's wisdom. Immediately reject that statement or that notion in your mind that says, God's tempting me. Immediately reject it, because wisdom knows that God and evil are absolute opposites. They are absolutely antithetical to one another. He cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But if that's the case, then where does temptation come? If God is God is sovereign over these situations, these trials, these testings, and he does actively test men. He does permit Satan to tempt Job, to tempt Jesus. If he is sovereign over the deeds of wicked men like Herod and Pontius Pilate and Nebuchadnezzar and Sennacherib and Pharaoh, if he is sovereign over these things, then how is it that he maintains his absolute holiness in the things that happen to me every day? And he answers that by saying that here's the internal part, goes back to this internal part. Because sin does not, you are not forced to sin by any circumstance that happens to you. Let me say that again. You are not forced to sin by any circumstance that happens to you. It doesn't matter if you're sick, if you're dying, or if your spouse leaves you, if your children hate you. It doesn't matter if you're being actively pursued and seduced by a person of the opposite gender that you're attracted to. It doesn't matter if your friends are doing drugs and are pressuring you. It doesn't matter if it doesn't matter what kind of situation you're in. It doesn't matter what's happening in your life or what's happening to you. There is nothing ever that happens that requires you to sin. That God puts you in a box and says there is no other way. So why do we sin? James says it's because of what's in you. It's because of what's in you. He says, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Desire. Okay? Desire is the big culprit right here. Is desire a bad thing?
When it comes from our old nature, it is.
So there's a distinction here that, the Bible does make that desire itself is not evil. It is good or evil depending on its object. We've talked about this before in terms of faith and hope. Okay? Faith is defined by its object. Hope is defined by its object, the things to which it attaches itself. The same with desire. Now, over the course of time, this word that he uses here does tend to mean more negative, wicked desire than good desire. But Paul, for example, when he talks about for the flesh lusts or desires against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, he doesn't use the word with spirit against the flesh, but it's implied in that parallelism. So there's a sense in which the spirit lusts after the things of God, and the flesh lusts after the things that are not of God. But here it is evil desire, because it's fixing on things that it should not fix on. So the fundamental problem with sin and temptation for a person is not the circumstance. The fundamental problem is the things that you desire. I desire the wrong thing. Okay? I desire my comfort over everything else. And so when I'm hurting, I'm miserable and I'm angry. I desire affluence, and so I steal. I mean, we're going to see more about this in James chapter 4. He's leading up to it. Okay, when he says, "What you ask and do not have," or what you murder and you kill and you steal because that's what you want. And it's your desire that's at war within your members. Members being either members of the body, but most likely members of the body, because that's the way members is usually used. This desire, this split within you, desiring different things. This bipolar person, this double-minded man who at one moment desires God and at the next desires sex. Or desires God and desires food. And so when the big, the federal deficit, I have to explain that, but there's a restaurant in Maine called Governor's, and they have the federal deficit. And when I was a teenager, we begged. My brother and I begged my parents to let us eat it because it's like this huge bowl of ice cream, and if you could eat the whole thing in an hour, you get a T-shirt and your thing on and whatever. They wouldn't let us do it, but I mean, when the federal deficit's put in front of you, you're like, I gotta eat that whole thing, So it's not that God put this big bowl of ice cream in front of me. I got it, God knows my weakness. He knows, God knows I've struggled with lust, and so it's not my fault that this pornography just randomly popped up on my screen. It's easy for us to fall back and say, God's testing me here. No. Ice cream is not evil.
Big bowl of it could be.
Yeah, sex is not evil. It's the pain is not evil. It's how we respond to it. It's our how we respond in our desires to that thing. So look at what he says here. He says each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Desire here, what he's doing, he's using another wisdom tactic, and he's using personification. It's interesting here because in Proverbs, both wisdom and folly are personified as women. And both of them are courting your attention. Wisdom is up here saying, come and buy. And folly's down here all dressed scantily and saying, come look at me. Come into my place. And so James is picking up this tactic, and he personifies your desire, a person's desire, as a seductress. She is luring and enticing you. This luring is a word that was used to me, like when they put the ring in your nose. Habakkuk again, put the ring in your person's nose and you lead them on, drag them away. To entice, like putting that piece of meat in front of a hungry dog. Your desire does that to you. You say, well, it's my desire. I mean, it seems kind of weird because we're like talking about a part of ourselves as if it's a third kind of person, as if it's outside of ourselves, trying to get us to do things. But it is ourselves. This is kind of something that we struggle with. I know Augustine, in his Confessions, he said, I used to blame my sin on that other part in me, that sinful nature kind of thing, but I came to realize that it was me. It was always me. Okay, so don't make the mistake here of saying, oh, well, my desire is something evil that I have to kill. No, your desire is you. Your desire is you. But because it's you, it has specific control over you and specific ability to entice you, to lure you, and what is it enticing and luring? Not itself, not its own desire. It's an enticing and luring your mind. You find yourself beginning to justify things. Just a little bit. I mean, nobody will find out. I can always repent later. It begins to entice you and to lure you away little by little. And then when it does that, then when this seductress entices you and gets you into her house and gets you to bed her, what does she conceive? What does she get pregnant with? She gets pregnant with sin. That's where sin happens. How do you avoid sin? You cut off the desire. So here's the thing, we are people who desire. God made us as desirous beings, if that's what you'd say. The problem is not desire. The problem is the objects of our desire. The problem is that our want to is broken. That we don't want what we ought to want. Or as I've been known to say in the past, we don't even want to want what we ought to want to want. We don't want the right things. Our want is broken. We desire things that are not holy and not righteous and not good. We desire other things besides God. You see how this is going to come back to, we said this double love commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. We don't want those things supremely. What we want is physical pleasure. What we want is security. What we want is affluence in society. What we want is power. And so our desire is broken. Yeah.
There's a good nature in me that wants Christ. There's a good nature in me that wars with the old nature. I understand that. And I know you're approaching it from the old nature, but there's a good nature in me that wants Christ. And the more that I want Christ, the more that I develop my relationship with Christ, the more that I hunger for Christ, the more that I realize that sin, when it is conceived, interferes with that relationship. Did I just jump the gun?
No.
Oh, okay.
Good.
But
And that's exactly true. And that's that a war within your members. And you've got to do things to put the victory on the side of the wisdom,
but
right?
the way you were saying it felt kind of one-sided, as in we are
in your flesh.
We are all
If we're gonna say use things in Paul's terms, in my flesh dwells no good thing. Okay, and so in ourselves, by ourselves, when we are put when God tests us, the reason we sin is because in that testing our desire goes the wrong way.
Amen.
Our desire pulls us to say, I want this. I don't want to be faithful right now. I don't want to be kind and loving and patient and joyful right now. I want revenge and anger and physical pleasure and food and whatever. That's what I want. More than love God, love neighbor. And so when we say, okay, fine, I'm going to go into want's house, bad want's house, then all of a sudden we find ourselves doing things we shouldn't do and fooling around, and she's pregnant with sin. And then when sin, the ESV here says when sin when it is fully grown, that's a bad. I don't think that's right, because it's not like she conceives sin and then all of a sudden you got a full-grown adult. It should probably be more like brought to term.
Brought to completion is what.
Right. So it's brought to term. So like Rachel is pregnant right now. She's in between the conceived and fully and brought to term. So in October, hopefully, into October,
November.
1st of November, first part of November.
Middle of November.
Middle of November. Sometime this year.
You're trying to move it up, that's good.
Sometime this year, Rachel's going to give birth to a child. That's what this means. When sin is brought to full term, when that fetus is brought to full term and desire, the mother gives birth. What does the mother give birth to? Death. It's a very vivid picture. I mean, it's the same concept, the same linkage that Paul uses, right? The wages of sin is death. Different metaphor, same link. Okay, God owes you a wage. You got paid. You did all this sin. Now you got to get paid for it. Okay, here's your paycheck. Death. Okay, Same here. Desire, you go into her, she conceives. That sin, and it was pleasurable. All sin is pleasurable for a time. Is that what Hebrews says? But that sin, I mean, it's going to come to term, and she's going to give birth. And what does she give birth to? Death. That is the natural cycle of why sin enters our life, and pain and suffering as a result of sin. So how do we get away from the giving birth to death? We have to not conceive sin. And how do we not conceive sin? We don't go into Desire's house when she's seducing us. And how do we not be seduced, lured, and enticed by desire? We have to have new desires. We have to have new desires. And where do we get new desires? Well, don't be deceived, beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So we don't have time to go into this today. I was hoping we would, but yeah, that's just a deep subject. But let me just preface 2 weeks from now by pulling out just a few things here. The first one is that we are to have new desires first as a gift, I think, from God. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously. Remember when we talked about this phrase, the God who gives? It's not just something God does, God gives. It's something God is, God who gives. He is a giving God. He is fundamentally a giving God. Just as God is fundamentally holy, absolutely holy, he is fundamentally, absolutely a giving God. Every good and perfect gift. An interesting thing in the Greek, I think he says it 2 different ways here to emphasize this. It's every good gift and every act of giving are the words here. Every time something is given and every gift that is given, every good thing comes from God. There is nothing good that you have that you did not receive from him. Nothing good that you have that you did not receive from him. And that goes for everybody, whether they're Christians or not. But I think more than that, what we ought to be reading in this is, just like if any of you lacks wisdom, if any of you lacks desire, what is a good desire? I mean, if you have a desire to commit adultery, we know that's a bad desire. What's the good desire? To pursue chastity and purity if you're single, to desire your wife if you're married. Can we ask God for that? Is that a good thing to desire your wife, your beloved? Absolutely, it's good. Read Song of Solomon. It's a good thing. Ask God, and he's a God who gives.
What about us single people over here?
Then ask God for purity and chastity. And will he give it? I think so. I mean, that's a good thing. And then also look at verse 18, and we'll talk about this more. But the reason I'm putting all this together is because this phrase here, this is a little awkward. The Bible uses a whole lot of metaphors for God, and a few times it speaks of God as a woman. How that shakes our patriarchy. Okay? Look at it. Of his own will he brought us forth. Of his own will he gave birth to us. God is a birthing mother. Does he need a doula?
No, Christ is the doula.
Okay. God is a birthing. So he begins to turn this picture around. Your desire will entice you and give birth to death. God, by his own determination, his own good pleasure, the one who gives perfectly and gives perfect gifts, gives birth to us, not by deception and luring and enticing, but by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creation. Life, not death. life and creation. Okay? And then finally, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but where do we get this new desire? I think it's found in verse 21, to receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. This implanted word, I think, is the word of the gospel. It's been implanted in you. It's in you. Peter says it is through that word that God has given you birth. Okay? It's in you, so receive it. How do you receive it? It's you live by it. You accept it as a standard of your life, of your choices, of your truth, of your wisdom. So that when you come to situations, say, God is testing me. No, the word of truth says, God can neither be tempted by evil, neither does he tempt anyone. And you let that implanted word begin to shape your desires. And where you see your desires do not match what the implanted words say your desires ought to be, then you ask the God who gives generously to all and without reproach to give you the right desire. And you plead with him and you receive that from him. And you endure. You endure. You endure. Comments? Questions? Snide remarks? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.